Hello everybody, Shrouded Hand here. Have you ever wondered how well you can truly know a person? The chances that someone close to you is hiding a terrible secret is pretty low, and yet there does exist the possibility that everything you trust and love in a person is a complete lie, a facade constructed just to deceive you. This is the story of In-sook. In South Korea in late March 2002, a 26-year-old man named Mr. Lee woke up in a hospital bed with no memory of how he'd got there or why. Doctors told him that he'd attempted to take his own life and that they'd barely managed to save him. His injuries were very severe. The kitchen knife that he'd used had perforated his intestines multiple times, and he would need to remain in the hospital for at least a few weeks. And this wasn't the first time it had happened. The worst part was that he couldn't remember anything leading up to his injuries. He had no idea when or why he had done it. Mr. Lee had battled with mental health issues for much of his life, but it seemed like the last 3 years had pushed him to the edge. It all began in the late 90s when Mr. Lee married In-sook. Due to strong opposition from both families, the couple didn't hold a formal wedding ceremony. Instead, they'd legally registered their marriage, making them husband and wife in the eyes of the law. Mr. Lee worked for a moving company and his wife was employed in the insurance sector. In-sook was described as a kind and gentle woman with the face of an angel, but she did have some serious personality flaws. She had seemingly zero impulse control. If she wanted something, then she had to have it there and then, and she would spend money with little regard for whether they could actually afford it. Not long after their marriage, became pregnant, and the couple welcomed a baby girl into their lives. Then, on the 17th of February in the year 2000, their then 3-year-old daughter tragically died. She'd fallen down and suffered a head injury. The exact circumstances around this fall remain unclear, but the two most commonly repeated versions are that she either fell from a desk or down a flight of stairs. Shortly after their daughter's death, a streak of bad luck seemed to hit the family, or more specifically, it hit Mr. Lee. Just a month after his daughter's death, on the 1st of April, Mr. Lee was hospitalised after losing consciousness and falling. He'd injured his head and suffered a concussion. On April the 28th, he fainted again. This time he fell down a flight of stairs and got another concussion. Doctors couldn't determine what was causing these episodes. They ran a series of tests, but everything came back normal. In mid-May, Mr. Lee woke up one morning and he was unable to see out of his right eye. When he touched his face, he realised that his eyelid was swollen and there was a painful sensation in his eye, as if something small, like a grain of sand or an eyelash, had got stuck underneath his eyelid. His wife immediately took him to the hospital, but the doctors couldn't explain exactly what had happened. The only thing they were able to establish was that his cornea was damaged and that the vision loss was permanent. The only silver lining was his insurance policy, or rather, policies. His wife, had taken out multiple insurance policies in Mr. Lee's name shortly after their daughter had passed away. The money from the insurance was enough to pay for his medical bills and to keep them afloat whilst he was off work. 2 months later, Mr. Lee was back in the hospital, this time with severe 2nd and 3rd degree burns on his face. He had no memory of what had happened. According to his wife, the accident occurred whilst they were cooking together in the kitchen. At one point she'd asked him to hand her a pan of boiling oil, and just as he was about to pass it to her, he'd fainted, spilling the oil onto himself. Although he physically recovered, he began to look less and less like the man that he was just a few months earlier. He'd lost weight, he was partially blind, and his face was permanently scarred from the burns. As for his mental state, he seemed to be slipping into a deep depression. By September 2000, Mr. Lee's mental state was so low that he took a knife from the kitchen and stabbed himself in the stomach. Or so it seemed. When Mr. Lee woke up in the hospital, he had no memory of the incident, and worse, he couldn't remember why he would want to do such a thing. This must have been an incredibly unsettling feeling. Everybody seemed certain that he'd done this to himself. Everybody except Mr. Lee. Eventually he recovered and returned to his everyday life, and for a time it seemed as though his streak of bad luck had finally come to an end. But it hadn't. On January the 15th, 2002, Mr. Lee was back in hospital, this time with multiple stab wounds to his belly, severe internal bleeding, and ruptured intestines. His wounds hadn't yet fully healed when, on the 3rd of February, he was brought back into hospital again. He had even more abdominal injuries, multiple perforations, internal bleeding, and organ damage caused by repeated stabbing. Again, he had no memory of how or why he would do this to himself. Luckily, each time this happened, his wife, In-sook, was with him, and she was able to call for help before he bled out. Unfortunately, this time his recovery didn't go so well. He was suffering from a severe skin infection and rhabdomyolysis, a life-threatening condition which causes muscle tissue to break down rapidly, releasing toxic proteins into the bloodstream. Despite receiving treatment for this, Mr. Lee passed away on March 25th, 2002. Over the course of 2 years, he'd been hospitalised more than 10 times. Doctors obviously questioned him after each incident, but he could never remember anything. All he ever remembered was that he was in the house with his wife, and then everything would go black. Next thing he knew, he would be waking up in the hospital. I'm guessing by now you've probably put 2 and 2 together. Something was seriously suspect about this, and In-sook seemed to be a prime factor in most of these injuries. Over this period of 2 years, had filed a total of 58 insurance claims, and she'd collected a combined payout of 280 million won. At the time, this was the equivalent of just over $200,000 US. The so-called accidents that had plagued Mr. Lee were in fact meticulously planned attacks orchestrated by his seemingly devoted wife. She'd mastered the art of appearing completely innocent. She even avoided wearing makeup to appear more pure and trustworthy. This tactic proved disturbingly effective. She remained entirely above suspicion, and nobody ever questioned her. Thanks to her experience in the insurance sector, In-sook was well aware of the flaws in the system at the time. Major insurance companies didn't share customer data, which made it possible to claim payouts from multiple policies purchased from different insurers without raising any red flags. All she needed to do was take out the insurance policies and then find a way to make an accident happen. And so In-sook began drugging her husband. She dissolved a high-dose mixture of antidepressants and sleeping pills into pomegranate juice and then offered it to him. The drink would leave Mr. Lee feeling dizzy and disorientated, and he would pass out shortly afterwards. Unfortunately for Mr. Lee, this drug combination had several side effects, one of which affected his short-term memory. The first time after he drank the drug-laced juice and was on the verge of fainting, she bumped into him roughly, causing him to fall and injure his head. But the insurance payout was smaller than she expected, so she tried again, this time pushing him down a flight of stairs. She was hoping that he would suffer critical injuries. After all, the insurance payout for a death is much higher than for a few bumps and scrapes. But Mr. Lee was lucky, and this accident only resulted in another concussion, though this time he would have to remain in hospital for quite a while. It was at this point that decided to change her approach. She knew very well that, apart from life insurance, permanent physical injuries offered one of the highest payouts. So she drugged her husband once more, and whilst he was unconscious, she retrieved a simple household object, a sewing needle. With one hand she pried open the eyelid of his right eye. With the other hand she drove the sharp end of the needle into his eyeball, piercing the cornea. When he woke up, panicking over his sudden loss of vision, she played the role of the concerned, faithful wife and took him to hospital. As you've also probably guessed, the second and third degree burns that Mr. Lee suffered weren't the result of an accident either. Burns, particularly facial burns, are some of the highest paying injuries as far as insurance policies are concerned. So after drugging Mr. Lee once again, as he was lying unconscious on the floor of the kitchen, filled a pan with cooking oil, waited for it to boil, and then poured it over his face. At that point, Mr. Lee had already suffered permanent injuries to his vision and severe burns to his face. The only remaining policy that could claim was his life insurance. So, after another drugging, she wrapped her unconscious husband's hand around a kitchen knife and stabbed him in the belly. But Mr. Lee turned out to be tougher than she expected. A single wound wasn't enough to kill him, so she tried again and again. Each attempt was more vicious than the last, leaving Mr. Lee with more and more damage. Eventually, she was successful. After her husband's death, In-sook wasted no time in spending the insurance payouts. She bought designer clothes and luxury goods, indulging in a lifestyle that she could never have afforded on her own, but she knew that this money would eventually run out. She needed to find another victim fast. She went out clubbing almost immediately after burying her husband, and she soon met a 31-year-old man named Mr. Im, a former athlete. By May 2002, she'd moved in with him. She lied to her new boyfriend about her past, once again slipping into her familiar role of the innocent, devoted partner and excellent wife material. But again, her real plan was to use her methods to profit from insurance claims. First, though, she needed to legalise the relationship. In November 2002, Mr. Im had a mysterious fall and was hospitalised. All he remembered was that In-sook had given him a drink just before he took a shower. Whilst he was showering, he began to feel woozy. He woke up in hospital later that day with a fractured lower back. The doctors told him that he'd slipped in the shower and he would be in hospital for at least a month. Whilst he was in hospital, In-sook stole his ID card and registered their marriage without his knowledge or consent. A month later, now out of hospital, Mr. Im woke up with a burning sensation in his eye. Once again, the doctors were unable to say what had caused it, but damage to his cornea meant that he would lose the sight in that eye. Some weeks later, he was also burned in a mysterious accident after falling unconscious. It was around this time that In-sook announced that she was pregnant. According to testimony from Mr. Im's relatives, she'd been unusually aggressive in her attempts to become pregnant prior to his accident, reportedly pressuring him into sex and making deliberate efforts to conceive. Unfortunately, Mr. Im passed away in 2003 from a severe bacterial skin infection brought on by his repeated mysterious injuries. As In-sook was pregnant at the time, her late husband's family suggested that, given her young age, she might consider terminating the pregnancy, believing that it would spare her the burden of raising a child alone. But insisted that she would carry the baby, saying that she wanted to honour Mr. Im's legacy. To demonstrate her devotion, she even organised a soul wedding, a traditional Korean ritual in which a person can symbolically marry a deceased loved one. At the same time, she received a payout of 39 million won, which was much less than she expected. It was later revealed that In-sook had planned to continue the abuse to claim more and more insurance policies, but Mr. Im had simply passed away too quickly. Needed a new plan. Even though she'd cut ties with her family a long time ago, she decided to return home. When her mother saw again, she was surprised. She didn't even know that her daughter had gotten married, not to mention having a baby. Nevertheless, moved back in with her mother and 2 brothers. On July 26th, In-sook gave her mother a glass of pomegranate juice. She told her that it would be good for her health. Shortly after drinking it, her mother began to feel faint and then collapsed. While she was unconscious, took out a 500cc syringe, the kind with a particularly large needle, often used in veterinary and industrial settings. She used this needle to pierce both of her mother's eyeballs, permanently blinding her. When the insurance money for that ran out, she struck again. This time she decided to target her older brother. When he passed out from drinking a drug-laced alcoholic drink, she yanked his eyes open and injected hydrochloric acid into both of his eyes, again causing permanent blindness. You're probably wondering, doesn't anyone suspect her at this point? The answer is no. Her brother was even convinced that there must be some sort of genetic flaw in the family, one that caused him and his mother to go blind. That was until April 2004 when he was hospitalised again. There isn't much reporting around the reason for this hospitalisation, but what happened whilst he was in hospital set off some red flags. When his sister came to visit, the older brother, although he was blind, almost immediately sensed that something was off. There was something in her voice that made him uneasy. He couldn't quite place what it was, but then he felt a gentle tug on his blankets, and the IV tube connected to his arm was moved. He instinctively grabbed the IV line and pulled the blanket up. At that moment, a nurse walked into the room and likely saved his life. Although he didn't know it at the time, his sister was just moments away from injecting a lethal dose of asthma medication and antidepressants into his IV line. The nurse didn't notice the syringe in Om's hands, but the interruption was enough and was forced to abandon her plan. She didn't attempt to visit her brother in hospital again, likely to avoid suspicion, but it was too late at that point. Her brother already had his suspicions, and he would no longer be fooled by her innocent facade. Ironically, it was the loss of his vision that finally allowed him to see behind her mask. He wasn't completely sure yet, but he decided to be very careful around his sister from then on. At the same time, In-sook knew that she'd come dangerously close to being caught, and she decided to keep a low profile. It's likely at this point that her older brother shared some of his suspicions with their mother, and the mother began to ask some difficult questions. Was worried that her mother would start talking to friends and neighbours, and this would stir up some level of exposure to her crimes. She began informing everyone around the family that her mother had got dementia, and it made her paranoid. In the meantime, she'd run out of money again. The failed attempt on her brother's life meant that there was no insurance payout for her, and she needed another plan. She informed the family that she'd bought a bigger and better house for them, and even found a buyer for the old apartment. Despite the fact that they were growing slightly more suspicious, she still had the benefit of the doubt. They were hesitant to move at first, but eventually her mother and 2 brothers began to look forward to moving into this bigger house. What they didn't know was that there was no new house. Had already sold the apartment that they were living in, and she'd nearly spent all of the money already. On the 9th of January 2005, as the moving date approached and the family prepared to clear out the apartment, In-sook bought some pomegranate juice for both of her brothers. Her younger brother drank it without question, but her older brother was still suspicious, and he replied that he didn't want any juice. But insisted. When he refused again, she grew angry, shouting at him until he finally gave in and drank it. By then he was almost certain that something had been added to the drink. He sipped it slowly, skimming the surface, hoping that whatever was in it had settled on the bottom. But soon afterwards he began to feel dizzy, and then he fainted. When he regained consciousness, he was sitting on the sofa. In his hand was a roll of burning newspaper. Although he was completely blind, the room was filled with a thick smoke, and there was an intense heat that told him that the building was on fire. He managed to wake his younger brother, and together they alerted the fire brigade. The responders arrived quickly, and they somehow managed to extinguish the flames, though both men suffered from burns. Their mother was devastated. Not only had her sons been injured in a fire and their apartment half burned, but the only silver lining of the story, this new house that they were supposed to move into, had turned out to be a lie. Received 204 million won from insurance payouts from the fire, but she had nowhere to go. Her family didn't want anything to do with her, so she approached a woman named Mrs. Kang. This was a lady who had once worked as her housekeeper. She asked her if her and her infant son could stay for a few days, just until she found a more permanent place to live. Mrs. Kang took pity on the young single mother and agreed to help. In-sook stayed in her home for 3 weeks. She promised that she would pay her way, but Mrs. Kang never saw a single penny from her. On February the 1st, Mrs. Kang finally asked her to leave. In revenge for this, In-sook set the Kang's family house on fire whilst she was still in it. She wrapped wet towels around herself and her infant son and then escaped through a window. Mrs. Kang and her family were less fortunate. Mrs. Kang and her children escaped, but they suffered serious burns. Her husband, Mr. Kang, died in the fire. This is the first time that In-sook had killed not for insurance money, but simply because somebody had slighted her. And she wasn't done. She showed up at the hospital where Mrs. Kang and her children were recovering, carrying gasoline and matches. Investigators would later point out the incredible cruelty of trying to set fire to a hospital that specialised in treating burn victims. Fortunately, the hospital CCTV system alerted the staff in time, and the fire was extinguished before it could spread. When the police reviewed the footage and saw how the fire was started, In-sook was finally arrested. Shortly afterwards, Om's older brother told a detective that bad things happen around my sister. People close to her get hurt or die. He then shared his long-held suspicions with the police. Investigators conducted a thorough search of hospital files, insurance payouts, and related documentation. Slowly, they uncovered a disturbing pattern, one that had gone unnoticed for years. Meanwhile, In-sook appeared before a judge to appeal for the suspension of her detention. She pleaded with the court, claiming that she couldn't remain in custody because her son was seriously ill. She told the judge, "I have nobody to take care of my 3-year-old son who has an incurable disease." This statement was only partially true. Her son did have a condition known as Kawasaki disease, which mostly affects children under 5 and causes an inflammation of the walls of the blood vessels, but it isn't incurable. For reasons that remain unclear, the court granted her request and allowed her to walk free whilst still being investigated. Sometime in March 2005, In-sook reached out to a woman named Miss Yu. This was a young woman that she'd met years earlier, during the time that her first husband, Mr. Lee, was recovering in hospital. Visited Miss Yu at her home. She offered her a drink, and this was the last thing that Miss Yu remembered. When she regained consciousness, she was blind and her credit card was missing. Would use this credit card to pay for her son's medical bills. On April 1st, 2005, In-sook's son passed away. The official cause of death was listed as complications caused by severe Kawasaki disease, yet some remain convinced that was responsible for his death. There are sources claiming that the boy was making a good recovery shortly before his death. By April 19th, there was enough evidence against her to arrest her once again, but by this time she was already seeing another man. It seems like he had a lucky escape there. When asked about her crimes, she claimed that drug addiction and mental illness was the reason behind her actions, but after a medical evaluation, doctors confirmed that she had no history of drug abuse, there was no drugs in her system, and she showed no signs of mental illness. She was then given the PCLR test, the Psychopathy Checklist Revised. This is a tool to assess the presence of psychopathic traits in a person. The checklist gives you a score out of 40. Any score over 30 would label a person as a psychopath. In-sook scored a perfect 40 out of 40. For comparison, Ted Bundy only scored 39. In court, In-sook displayed no remorse for her crimes, and she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She appealed the verdict twice, but on both occasions the court upheld the original ruling. One of the saddest parts of this case is that while she committed most of her crimes out of greed, each time she received an insurance payout, most of it went towards hospital bills to treat the very injuries that she'd inflicted. In the end, only a fraction of each payout was truly left for her, so she had to keep going again and again, inflicting greater harm each time, chasing a lifestyle that she could never sustain. Her methods were deeply flawed, and she knew it, but it didn't matter. She treated the people closest to her like disposable cattle, trading their health and even their lives for just a few more weeks of luxury. Permanent damage in exchange for temporary comfort, over and over again. So that's the story of In-sook, the Black Widow, Lady Death. I hope you found that interesting. Thank you very much for watching, and as always, thank you to the patrons. The support is much appreciated. Thank you very much. Until next time, goodbye.